Last weekend I was listening to one of my favorite shows on National Public Radio, This American Life, and there was a segment about a school in New York City, the Brooklyn Free School. Maybe you heard this story too. It's a school where students decide everything about how the school will be run, what classes will be offered, course schedules, all their own rules. Anytime anyone has an issue, they can call an all-school meeting. That's how they settle disputes and make decisions for themselves. Several years ago, one student called a meeting because she was concerned about the rise of technological gadgets in the classroom. She said they were creating a poor learning environment. After some discussion, it appeared that most of her classmates agreed with her because they ended up deciding that every other week would be a no screens week. It was a week where every other week, computers, phones, video games, all those things were prohibited from being used. Just a few months ago, another student called an all-school meeting to propose dropping the rule. We need to be able to do research, he said. Research should be encouraged, but when you do it, you get in trouble. The point was that it was a rule that had been intended for good, but when it was strictly enforced, it actually did harm. Most rules, the rules our parents set for us when we're children, the laws that govern our society, the Robert's Rules, I guess, and the Ten Commandments and other biblical laws, these rules are intended for good. They're supposed to help us live a happier life. But sometimes, when we lose sight of their intended purpose, rigid enforcement of the rules can actually cause harm. We don't usually think of the Old Testament laws as a gift. Most of us Lutherans have been taught that the law points out our failures. The law says what we're supposed to do, and we always fall short. Through the law, we realize we are sinners and recognize our need for Christ. But really, the law is first and foremost a gift from God. It was given by God to show us how to live in harmony with one another and with all of creation. Take the third commandment, the Sabbath commandment, today's first reading from Deuteronomy. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Why are we to observe the Sabbath? That's actually a pretty interesting question. The Ten Commandments appear in two different places in the Old Testament, both in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. When this commandment is given in Exodus, it refers back to the creation story. In 6 days, we are told, God made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and God rested on the seventh day. So we too should work 6 days and rest on the seventh. But the Deuteronomy version of this commandment, the version that was read here this morning, says something different. The seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, it says. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or female slave or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or any of the resident aliens in your town, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. The Deuteronomy version of the Sabbath law commands that the Israelites aren't supposed to do any work, and they're not supposed to even let their children or their livestock do any work either, so that their slaves may rest too. You remember what it was like to be a slave in Egypt, the reasoning goes. So treat your slaves with compassion, and once a week, give them a break. A people who have known slavery, who have known suffering, ought never impose suffering on others. That's the message that comes through loud and clear. The Sabbath commandment is given as a gift, and it's a gift that isn't just for the Israelites. Deuteronomy makes a special point of saying that the reason no work is to be done on the Sabbath is so that slaves might have an opportunity to rest too. The gift of the Sabbath law is a gift for everyone, including and especially those on the margins, those on the fringes of society. That's some important context for today's gospel lesson. In this story from the Gospel of Mark, Jesus and his disciples are walking through fields, and as they go, they pluck heads of grain. "What are they doing?" the Pharisees ask, appalled. "Why are they doing what's not allowed on the Sabbath?" Jesus turns to them and says, basically, because they're hungry, that's why. In the next scene, Jesus is in the synagogue when a man with a withered hand comes before him. Jesus calls the man forward, and the Pharisees take notice. They watch intently as Jesus tells this man to stretch out his hand. Moments later, Jesus has healed the man, and the Pharisees are furious. At the end of the story, they leave and conspire to have Jesus killed, this man who blatantly defies the commandments. When it becomes an end in itself, rather than a means to a more just and peaceful world, a rule that is intended for good can become an instrument of harm. Like the students who discover that a No Screens Week hindered their ability to learn, sometimes we discover that legalistic enforcement of rules can actually cause suffering, rather than guiding us into more abundant life. The Sabbath law, like all rules, is intended as a gift. At the heart of this commandment is concern for people on the margins of society who are especially susceptible to mistreatment and abuse. And in today's gospel lesson, we see how these very people can be hurt by rigid, legalistic enforcement of the Sabbath commandment. It is not in keeping with the spirit of the Sabbath law to refuse to feed the hungry or offer care to those in need of healing. Treating the Sabbath requirement as an end in itself, rather than a means to a more just society, actually twists it into something that inflicts suffering on people desperately in need of our care and protection.